The Desert Siren, a story by Mythical Tale Teller. The sound of boots on cobblestone rang in Remi's ears as he sprinted through the crowded streets, his own boots pounding, heart hammering, and every instinct screaming that if he slowed for even a second, the guards would be on him. Their shouts pierced the morning air, sharp and angry, carrying his name like a curse. "Remi, you good-for-nothing thief! Stop!" He ducked around a corner so fast his shoulders scraped the brick, nearly toppling a merchant's cart, and pressed himself against the wall, chest heaving, sweat stinging his eyes. Ahead, a wooden post swayed in the wind, a wanted poster pinned haphazardly to it. The paper was ragged and faded, but the inked face was unmistakable. Remi's own, drawn crudely, eyes frozen in a scowl that seemed to follow him as he ran. Beneath it, bold letters promised a reward enough to tempt any desperate soul. Dead or alive, reward. Gold enough to last a lifetime. A grim smile tugged at his lips as he brushed past it, heart racing. To the city, he was a criminal, a name meant to strike fear. To himself, he was a survivor, a thief reclaiming what had been stolen from his family generations ago. The clatter of wheels drew his attention. A wagon lumbered down the narrow street, its wooden wheels squeaking, barrels and crates piled high. Without thinking, Remi dove behind it, sliding into the shadow of the cargo, feeling the rough wood scrape along his palms. The guards thundered past, voices fading but still tense with menace, leaving only the distant echo of their pursuit. He allowed himself a moment to breathe, lungs burning, before drawing the dagger from beneath his cloak. The steel gleamed faintly in the patch of sunlight that filtered through the alley, and his fingers traced the worn etchings along the hilt. Each curve, each groove, was familiar, a link to his ancestors, the family of thieves who had mastered the shadows and the city streets long before him. This blade had been auctioned away when his family fell on hard times, sold to strangers while he had nowhere to turn. Now it was his again, reclaimed with daring and cunning. Remi crouched low behind the stacked crates, the wagon's wooden frame pressing against his back, hiding him in a shadowy pocket where the morning sun could not reach. The city streets had grown quieter, the clamor of merchants and carts fading as the wagon rolled onward, and the two men guiding it began to speak, their voices casual and unguarded. "Next stop's the edge of the desert," one said, rubbing the sweat from his forehead. "If we keep on this path, we'll be in Solara by nightfall tomorrow. Could be a fresh start, eh?" "Aye," the other replied, leaning against a crate and letting out a long sigh. "I could use that. Out there, no one knows us. No one's breathing down your neck, watching your pockets for what little coin you have." He laughed softly, and the sound carried a wistful note, like a man dreaming aloud. Remi's ears pricked at the word desert. A new city across the endless sand was exactly what he needed, a place far enough from the guards and the wanted posters where he could vanish and perhaps build something like a life. He stayed perfectly still, letting their voices guide his decision. Solara, he thought. That would be the city where he could start over. Then their conversation shifted, dipping into darker tones. "You ever hear about the Desert Siren?" the first man asked, lowering his voice. "They say she lures travelers with her voice, sings them into a trance, and then, well, you never see them again." The second chuckled, a grim, nervous sound. "I'd rather have a monster sing me to my death than be stabbed or robbed by another man. At least a siren's honest about it." Remi's lips twitched into a hidden grin, the wagon creaking under the men's weight as they shifted. Men are the true monsters, he thought to himself, the humor bitter and sharp in his mind. He had learned early in life that greed, betrayal, and cruelty often came in human form, that the world's worst predators wore skin and breathed. The story of the siren, enchanting though it was, held no terror for him. He had survived far worse, and he had learned which dangers were truly deadly. As the wagon rumbled onward, carrying him unknowingly toward the desert, Remi made his choice. He would follow them. he would cross the sands. No longer would he be plagued by his or his family's reputation, nor would he have to worry about guards on his tail day in and day out. Solara would be his home, his new start. Remi had been hidden among the crates and sacks, waiting for the moment when the men's focus drifted. Hunger had gnawed at him through the morning, and he had risked a bite of their food, tearing into a loaf of hard bread with greedy hands. The scent of dried meat and the cool water in their jugs had been irresistible, and for a brief, quiet moment, he allowed himself the satisfaction of a small, stolen meal. The thud of boots on wood made him freeze. The men had reached the rear of the wagon, and their eyes widened in shock as they spotted him crouched among the supplies, crumbs on his lips and the bread in his hands. "What the?" the taller man barked, reaching for the blade at his belt. Remi did not wait. He sprang to his feet, dropping the bread and drawing his sword in one smooth motion. The smaller man drew a knife of his own, stepping between Remi and the crates, while the taller one lunged with a short sword, eyes wide with anger. The first clash rang out like a bell. Steel met steel with a sharp clang, sparks flying where Remi's blade met the edge of the sword. He ducked low, rolling to the side as the smaller man slashed, the tip of the knife carving a shallow line across his forearm. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but he ignored it, driving his sword upward in a swift counter. The smaller man stumbled back, surprise flickering across his face as the sword grazed his side. The taller man pressed the attack, swinging with brute strength, each strike meant to overpower. Remi danced, sidestepping and twisting, letting the weight of his opponent work against him. The heat of the desert sun made sweat bead along his temples, dripping into his eyes, but he moved with the precision and instinct that came from years of surviving streets and shadows. He ducked under a wide swing, slashing across the taller man's arm. The blade bit deep enough to make him grunt and drop the weapon, clattering against the sand. The smaller man lunged again, but Remi met him with a flick of the wrist, driving the sword into the man's thigh with enough force to bring him down to one knee. A harsh laugh escaped Remi's lips as he stepped back, surveying the two men who now knelt and staggered, bleeding and defeated but alive. He had not killed them, though the desert heat and their wounds left them vulnerable. Breathing heavily, Remi took what he needed: water from their canteens, dried meat, a leather pouch filled with coins, and as many sacks of goods he could load up on a single camel. He swung himself onto the camel when he was finished, patting its neck with a quick hand. "Thanks for the ride," he called back to the men, spurring the animal into motion. The two men watched him leave, their anger and disbelief a haze in the scorching Sunday. Remi glanced back once, letting a smirk cross his face. He had taken what he needed, bested them in combat, and walked away with enough goods to live easy for a while. The desert stretched out before him, endless and unforgiving, but it was also the path to the life he had decided to claim, a life where survival depended on skill, cunning, and, if necessary, the swift edge of a sword. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of gold beneath a falling Sunday. Each dune shimmered with dying light, the sky above washed in a blaze of crimson and amber that slowly deepened into violet. Remi guided the camel to a halt on the lee side of a dune, the creature grunting softly as it sank to its knees in the cooling sand. He slid from the saddle, legs aching from the long ride, and dropped heavily into the sand. For the first time since the fight at the wagon, he allowed himself to breathe without haste, the silence of the desert pressing against his ears. The wind was gentle here, carrying with it only the faint hiss of sand shifting against sand, a sound that felt ancient and endless. Remi tugged the bundle of spoils closer, untying the leather straps with quick, practiced fingers. Inside lay everything he had claimed: purses of coin, scraps of jewelry, bits of silver, polished smooth from handling. His eyes scanned over each piece, the weight of survival gleaming back at him in every stolen treasure. To others, it was wealth. To him, it was days of food, nights of safety, another chance to outlast the world that had tried so hard to break him. But his hand stilled as he reached deeper into the bundle. From beneath a pile of trinkets, his fingers brushed something small, fragile. He drew it out slowly. In his palm rested a child's toy, no more than a simple carved horse, worn down from being held too often, one of its legs chipped. The wood was smooth, carrying the faint marks of a craftsman who had made it with care, perhaps for a son or daughter who had clutched it at night. Remi turned it over in his hand, thumb tracing its shape, and for the first time that day the weight of his thefts pressed against him. He had never struck women, never raised his sword against children. That line he had never crossed, yet here was proof of the other wound he left behind. By taking food, coin, and keepsakes from strangers, how many children had he pushed closer to the kind of life he had known? A life of empty stomachs, of nights curled in alleys, of parents lost not to mercy but to necessity. His throat tightened. He remembered his own nights as a boy, staring at the dark sky, clutching at nothing, surviving on scraps others left behind. The bitterness of hunger, the loneliness of having no one to turn to, was he now carving that same fate into the lives of other children, unseen and unheard? The desert wind shifted, cool against his skin as the last of the sun dipped beneath the horizon. Shadows stretched long across the dunes, the world falling quiet and solemn. Remi stared at the little horse in his hand, its chipped leg catching the fading light, and for a moment the glittering treasures around him felt heavier than iron chains. He closed his fist around the trinket, the dagger at his side pressing against his ribs, both reminders of where he had come from and the path he had chosen. The desert waited, vast and merciless, and somewhere beyond it lay Solara, the city where he dreamed of starting over. The desert night had begun to settle, the air cooling as the last light bled away from the horizon. Remi sat with his back against the slope of a dune, the small wooden horse still resting in his palm, its smooth edges warmed by his touch. A heaviness lingered in his chest, but he closed his fist around the trinket, forcing the thoughts from his mind. Brooding would not change the past, nor feed him tomorrow. With a sharp breath, he pushed the weight of guilt aside. Survival demanded a harder heart. That was when he heard it. At first, it was faint, drifting on the desert wind like a whisper that might have belonged to memory or dream, a melody soft, haunting, unlike any sound the desert should have carried. It rose and fell like the tide of an unseen ocean, threading through the air with a sweetness that made the hair on his arms stand on end. Remi lifted his head, eyes narrowing against the darkness. The song came again, clearer this time, lilting and pure. No instrument, no human hand could produce such a sound. It slid into the air with impossible grace, a voice so beautiful it seemed the very stars must have gathered to listen. He smirked faintly, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. So the stories were true then. The Desert Siren, luring men with her voice, promising paradise before tearing their lives away. A monster, cloaked in beauty. Remi rose slowly, brushing sand from his cloak, eyes fixed on the distance where the song drifted from. He knew what it was, knew what awaited anyone foolish enough to seek it out. Yet, instead of fear, there was curiosity, amusement even. Perhaps it was the arrogance of survival, or the quiet ache inside him that no treasure could silence, but he found himself moving toward the sound. He left the camel kneeling at the base of the dune, reins slack. The beast grunted softly, shifting in the sand, but Remi paid it no mind. The bundles of coin, jewels, and food, everything he had fought for that day, lay strapped to the saddle. He did not glance back at them. None of it mattered in that moment. Not the water, not the gold, not even the child's trinket tucked safely into his pocket. His steps carried him across the dunes, boots sinking into cool sand as the melody guided him forward. Each note shimmered in the air like a silver thread, tugging him deeper into the night. The desert stretched endless and dark, the stars sharp above, and still he walked, willingly abandoning every possession he had gained for the promise hidden within that song. Remi's hand brushed the hilt of his dagger, and his smile grew wry. If this was a trap, then let it spring. He would meet it head-on, as he always had. The song drew him over ridge after ridge of sand, until the desert seemed to fold in upon itself, dunes bowing away to reveal a sight that stole his breath. There, nestled in the hollow of the land, shimmered an oasis. Palms rose tall and swaying, their fronds whispering secrets to the night wind. Moonlight glistened across the water, turning its surface into liquid silver. The air smelled of life, damp and sweet, impossibly rich in a place that should have known only dust and thirst. And at the heart of it stood a woman. She was unlike any he had ever seen. Her hair tumbled down her shoulders in dark waves that caught the starlight, her eyes gleamed like polished gems, and her skin seemed to glow faintly against the shadowed palms. Every line of her body was graceful, fluid, as though she had stepped out of some forgotten dream. Her lips parted as the last note of her song lingered in the air, carrying with it a promise of comfort and wonder. Remi slowed, though his feet carried him forward without his bidding. The sword at his side felt heavier, almost forgotten, as his gaze locked onto hers. She smiled, a curve so warm it cut through the cool desert night, and raised a hand in beckoning. "Come closer," she said, her voice as soft and liquid as the song that had drawn him here. "You have traveled far, thief. You are weary, hungry, burdened. Drink, and you will find rest. Drink, and your wildest dreams will be yours." Her words wrapped around him like silk, soothing the ache in his muscles, the dryness in his throat, the heaviness in his heart. The oasis gleamed brighter, the water rippling as though in anticipation of his touch. He felt the lure pull at him, tugging deeper than instinct, deeper than hunger or thirst. It pressed against the hidden corners of his soul where yearning lived. Remi stopped just short of the water's edge, his eyes fixed on the glimmering pool. Every treasure he had ever stolen seemed pale compared to this promise. Every coin, every jewel, every fight, it all felt hollow in the presence of such beauty, such certainty. The woman's voice lowered to a whisper, intimate and sweet. "All you must do is drink, and everything you desire will be yours." Her words hung in the air, tempting and undeniable, as the moonlight danced across the oasis and beckoned him closer. As her words flowed over him like warm water, Remi felt something shift in the air. The edges of the oasis blurred, the palms fading into soft light. The scent of damp earth and sweetness deepened until it became almost dizzying. The water at his feet rippled once, twice, then stilled, and in its mirrored surface he saw not his reflection but something else entirely. A throne rose up from a sea of gold coins and jewels, each one gleaming like a captured star. Necklaces of gemstones spilled across the steps, rings clinked together as they slid over mounds of silver. The dagger that had been his heirloom was now encrusted with jewels, sitting at his side as though it were merely another ornament. And at the center of it all, there he sat, Remi, draped in silks and finery, crowned with gold, his hands resting on the arms of a throne carved from ivory. For a moment, the sight dazzled him. The endless hunger that had pushed him through life's alleys and shadows quieted under the weight of so much wealth. This was what he had always told himself he wanted. Enough treasure to never steal again, enough power to never be hunted, enough safety to bury his past. But as he stared deeper into the vision, he felt the silence. No voices, no laughter, no footsteps echoed in that vast hall of riches. The throne room stretched endlessly, its walls made of treasure but empty of life. He could feel it in his chest, a hollow ache like a wound loneliness so sharp it cut through the glittering illusion. He imagined reaching out, offering a jewel, a piece of gold, but there was no one to take it, no one to share the victory, no one to understand the cost. The smile that had begun to form on his lips faded. His fingers twitched at his sides, restless, uneasy. He had chased survival his whole life, believing that wealth would be the answer. But here, in this shimmering mirage of triumph, He felt smaller than ever. This was not freedom. This was a gilded cage. The sound of the siren's voice still hovered around him, coaxing, promising. Yet now it rang differently in his ears. It no longer felt like a promise. It felt like a trap, woven from his own dreams. Remi's gaze hardened. The dagger at his side seemed heavier, more real than the coins or the throne. Wealth without connection was just another kind of hunger, another kind of desert. A low, unexpected laugh broke from Remi's chest, startling even himself. It cut through the siren's song like a blade through silk. He shook his head, almost amused at the trickery, at his own willingness to believe it for even a moment. "You almost had me," he muttered, voice hoarse but steady. Instead of kneeling to drink, Remi reached beneath his cloak and drew the dagger. The blade gleamed faintly in the dying light, not with jewels or gold, but with the weight of memory. He turned it once in his hand, then without hesitation dropped it into the pool. The water hissed. Ripples spread outward in jagged lines, as though the surface itself recoiled from the steel. The reflection of his throne fractured and dissolved. Coins and jewels crumbled to dust, vanishing into a swirl of sand. The oasis buckled, palm trees snapping like brittle reeds, their green dissolving into dry husks. What had seemed lush and eternal collapsed into nothing more than the desert he had known all along, vast, endless, merciless. The siren let out a sound, half scream, half snarling hiss. Her beauty flickered like a candle flame in a storm, her features twisting, warping. The face that had promised comfort melted away, leaving behind something grotesque. Her figure remained that of a woman, but her skin grew ashen and cracked, her mouth stretching impossibly wide to reveal rows of jagged, predatory teeth. Her nails lengthened into curved talons, black as obsidian, catching the dim light like sharpened blades. Her eyes no longer shimmered with allure, they burned with feral hunger. She stepped from the ruin of the oasis, her voice no longer a song but a guttural growl that reverberated in his bones. The desert wind howled with her, sweeping away the last traces of illusion until only sand and stone remained. Remi's lips curved in a grim smile. The trick was over. Now came the truth. The siren lunged with a ferocity that seemed to tear the air itself apart. Her claws carved furrows into the sand where he had stood a heartbeat before. Remi rolled aside, the dry heat still clinging to his skin. He scrambled to his feet, drawing his sword, the blade once more gleaming faintly in the dim light. She struck again, faster this time. Her talons raked across his arm, tearing through cloth and flesh alike. Pain flared white-hot, and he hissed, clutching the wound even as he swung upward in a desperate arc. The blade met her side, cutting shallow, barely slowing her. She snarled, the sound vibrating deep in her throat, and backhanded him with enough force to send him sprawling across the ground. His back slammed into a dune, knocking the breath from his lungs. The world spun, sand filling his mouth, his eyes, his nose. He coughed, staggered to his knees, only to see her shadow fall over him. The siren's maw stretched wide, teeth glinting in the last traces of light. Her claws raised, ready to strike the finishing blow. And then, in that moment between one breath and the next, memories flooded him. Not of thrones or riches, but of faces he had long buried. The old baker who once left bread on the windowsill where a starving boy lingered too long. The weary guard who pretended not to see him slip away with an apple in hand. The woman in the alley who had pressed a blanket into his arms one winter's night without a word. Small mercies, kindnesses he had never asked for but had been given all the same. Remi's chest tightened. His whole life, he had thought of himself as utterly alone, surviving only by his wits and his thefts. But he saw now, clear as the stars above the desert, that he had been carried in part by other strangers who had helped when they had no reason to. If he lived past this moment, he would no longer take without giving. He would be better. He would help, as others had helped him, and he would not waste the chance that life had been quietly giving him all along. The siren's claws descended, sharp enough to split stone. But Remi's body moved with a clarity born from the memories still alive in his mind. He shifted, not away, but forward, his boots digging into the shifting sand for leverage. In that instant, he became weightless, every thought reduced to one clear motion. His arm shot upward, sword clenched tight. The blade caught the faint glow of the moon as it rose above the horizon, and in a single, smooth thrust, he drove it into the siren's chest. The sound that tore from her throat was not human. It was a piercing wail that reverberated across the dunes, carrying both fury and disbelief. Her body jerked violently, talons stopping inches from his face as the strength drained from her limbs. Her glowing eyes widened, rage flickering into something like fear as the sword sank deeper. Remi gritted his teeth, pressing until he felt the resistance break, the point of the blade sinking into the heart of the monstrous figure. The siren let out one final shriek, a sound that made the desert itself seem to tremble, then staggered back. With a sharp pull, Remi yanked the sword free. Black ichor gushed from the wound, thick and foul, spattering the sand at his feet. The siren staggered again, clutching at her chest, her monstrous figure unraveling. Her claws curled inward, her form collapsing in on itself, as if the life that had sustained her illusions was finally snuffed out. She fell to her knees, her twisted face contorted in a mask of anguish, then toppled onto her side. The desert fell silent. The body twitched once, then stilled, her talons sinking into the sand as though the earth itself was eager to claim her. Remi stood there for a moment, chest heaving, the sword slick in his hand. He looked down at the creature that had nearly ended him, then at the dagger that had once been nothing more than a thief's trophy. Tonight it had been his salvation. Wiping the black blood from his sword's edge, he slid it back into its sheath. The siren lay defeated, her song forever silenced. For the first time in days, the desert was truly quiet. The night stretched long and heavy across the desert, the stars above bright and sharp as shards of glass scattered over black velvet. Remi's legs carried him back through the dunes, his sword still streaked with the dark ichor of the fallen siren. Each step felt slower now, not with exhaustion, but with the weight of everything that had just taken place. When he reached the camel, it raised its head and snorted, the beast's dark eyes glimmering faintly in the starlight. Tied to its back were the sacks of stolen goods, coins, trinkets, bolts of cloth, bits of jewelry that only hours ago had seemed like a lifeline. Remi stared at them for a long moment. They no longer felt like treasure. They felt like chains, heavy reminders of the man he had been clinging to out of habit, not need. He stepped forward and swung his arm, knocking the sacks to the sand one after another. The coins spilled with a muted chime, scattering across the dune until they disappeared into the shifting grains. Trinkets rolled and vanished, cloth unfurled, jewelry glinted for a heartbeat before being swallowed by the desert. The camel groaned as its burden lightened, lifting its head as if grateful. Remi swung himself onto the saddle with practiced ease, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. With a click of his tongue and a tug of the reins, he urged the camel forward. The desert stretched wide before him, and far beyond the dunes, the faint outline of a city gleamed against the horizon, its towers and walls painted silver beneath the moonlight. For the first time, the sight did not feel like a mark to exploit or a hiding place to vanish into. It looked like possibility. As he crested a dune, he spotted movement below. A small caravan of travelers trudged along the sand, 3 men and 2 women, their robes worn from the journey, their camels burdened with supplies. Their steps were slow, their bodies weary. Remi guided his camel toward them. The travelers looked up sharply, eyes narrowing with suspicion as they saw the sword at his hip and the lean, ragged figure upon the beast. One of the men reached for the hilt of a blade at his side, but Remi lifted his hands from the reins, showing them empty, open palms. "I don't mean you harm," he said, his voice carrying across the sand. "You look like you need this more than I do." He dismounted and opened one of his packs, pulling out a skin of water and a bundle of dried rations. He placed them gently in the sand between himself and the group, then stepped back. The weary faces of the travelers softened as thirst and hunger won out over their caution. One by one, they stepped forward, the man in front taking the water skin with a bow of his head. "You've saved us," the man said hoarsely after drinking. His voice cracked from days without enough water. "We owe you a debt, stranger. I have something, an ancient coin, passed down in my family. It is worth more than you know in the city." Remi shook his head, waving the offer aside. "I don't want your coin. Keep it." But the man shook his head stubbornly, his sun-worn face tightening with determination. "No, you saved us. I must repay you with something worthy. Please, it is yours." He began to search himself, patting at his robes, digging into pouches and bags, his fingers frantic as though terrified that the coin might have slipped away. The others watched in silence, the women clutching the food, the younger man steadying their camels. Remi stood quietly, watching the man fumble through his belongings, and though he had refused, a small smile tugged at his lips. It had been a long time since someone had insisted on giving instead of taking. Remi watched the man pat his robes frantically, fingers searching every pocket and pouch, as if the coin might have vanished into the sand at any moment. The wind whipped across the dunes, tugging at their cloaks and tossing grains of sand into the air. The man's face was etched with frustration, confusion, and a growing sense of panic. Remi stepped closer, voice calm. "Here's how you can repay me," he said, eyes glinting in the starlight. "Guard your pockets. Make sure nothing falls into the wrong hands." The man's brow furrowed, disbelief etched deep into his features. My pockets," he stammered, panic still rising in his voice. I don't." Remi's lips curved into a faint, wry smile. Without a word, he reached into the folds of his own robes and withdrew the ancient coin, the very coin the man had been desperately searching for. With a flick of his wrist, precise and almost casual, he sent it spinning through the air. The coin landed squarely in the man's palm, spinning once before coming to rest. The traveler froze, eyes widening in shock and then narrowing in sudden comprehension. His jaw dropped. "Keep it safe," Remi said simply. "Guard it from thieves like me." The man could only nod, still staring at the coin as Remi swung himself onto the camel with fluid ease. The animal shifted under his weight, then began its steady walk across the dunes. The desert rolled before him like a sea of gold, undulating endlessly beneath the starlight. Far off, the city emerged over the crest of a distant hill, its towers glinting faintly in the first rays of dawn. Streets wound between the buildings like veins of stone, rooftops catching the light as if welcoming him to a new life. Remi's grip tightened on the reins, his heart lifting. This city was not just a destination, it was a chance to be someone different, to live by choice rather than survival alone. Behind him, the desert stretched wide and silent, carrying with it the remnants of illusions, the defeated siren, and the treasures he had chosen to leave behind. He leaned forward, urging the camel onward, each step bringing him closer to the city, across the desert, and to the life he intended to claim.